this morning. If you want to open your Bibles to Numbers chapter 24, that's where we're at in our examination of this book, as we've been trying to gain some insight, not just historical insight, but trying to also appreciate maybe some of the lessons that are learned as it relates to this interesting book. As the people of God, the Israelites, have been led out of Egypt, they've had lots of difficulties and challenges and problems of their own creation by their behaviors and choices. And so that's put us in lots of interesting circumstances and situations where God continues to deal with His people. And we're dealing with this fellow by the name of Balaam, who was supposed to be giving the message of God and to Balak. And Balak doesn't like any of the answers that Balaam's been giving him in these last several moments. And we're going to get to that final moment where Balaam kind of says, I'm done. And the consequences in some ways that happened to Edom and Moab because of their refusal to just accept God's plans and purposes that He has. But before we get back into that discussion, if you would, let's bow our heads together, share in a word of prayer before we start this morning. Our Father in heaven, thank You for this day that You've blessed us with, this wonderful opportunity that we have to assemble here, to appreciate Your testimony, to open your book and learn from this great history, to appreciate the lessons that we can glean from it, and just appreciate Your wisdom in guiding Your people always. Strengthen us in our study today. Guide us in all that is good and right in Your eyes. And we pray this through Christ's name. Amen. All right, so let's jump back, right? So, real quick refresher. So we're in this final oracle, if you will, or final parable, or final prophecy. There's different words are used as it relates to what Balaam's been doing as it relates to these conversations he has with Balak. But every time Balaam says to him, Balaam shouldn't even have been there, right? Number one, we can back up a little further. Balaam should have just listened to God's original instructions, said, you stay home. If those guys want you to go with them and check things out, you just need to stay home because I'm not cursing my own people, basically is what God tells him. Balaam goes anyway, and so then God teaches him uses an angel and his donkey, right? He uses an angel and his donkey in order to be able to get Balaam to kind of wake up to what God really wants him to do. And so then Balak hasn't done yet. So Balak starts doing what? He starts showing him what? Yeah, he starts showing, I promised you great wealth and value, right? I'm going to elevate you to greatness if you'll just go curse those people for me. And so every time Balaam says, nope, Balak says, well, let's go look at this now. And Balaam says, nope. And he says, well, let's go look at this then instead. And he just keeps showing him more and more and more, trying to persuade him. And we're finally now, we've been talking about those over our last couple of classes. We're finally now to the last of those here in Numbers chapter 24 and verse 15. And so let's take a quick look at this last of these oracles or prophecies that Balaam has been delivering to Balak. So he took up this parable, this address with Balak, and said, Balaam the son of Beor hath said, and the man whose eyes are open hath said, he hath said, which heard the words of God, and knew the knowledge of the Most High, which saw the vision of the Almighty, falling into a trance, but having his eyes open, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not now. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth. And Edom shall be a possession, Seir also shall be a possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly. So let's pause for a quick second. What do you hear in some of that language that's in that? Say it again, Brian, I'm sorry. Yeah, you hear messianic statements, right? You can see this pointing to a time in which even greater things are going to happen through Israel. And keep in mind, it's part of the description and the understanding that Balak needs to come to an understanding about. I can't go curse those people, number one, because God didn't tell me to. God hasn't cursed them, so I can't do that, number one. They're blessed because God has blessed and chosen them, and they will continue to be such because the star of Jacob has to come. They will continue to be in the blessings of God even when they fail miserably, and even when they have to be punished because of that. And even when they face consequences because of their choices and behaviors, God has chosen them for a purpose that is not going to be moved. And He uses even a reference to some future things that are going to come. Now here's what else is interesting to me about this portion. Originally, when God told His people, when you travel through Edom and Moab, you're to do what? Yeah, travel through. Don't bother people. Don't destroy anything. If you need something, you're going to what? You're going to pay for it, right? So if your cattle graze on somebody's ground, you're going to pay for what they ate. If you need water, you're going to pay for it. If you need to go to the marketplace in one of these communities or villages, you're going to pay. You're not just going and taking stuff. Because I have given those places to their original inheritance and descendants, and you're not getting those. But because Edom and Moab refused to follow in the purposes and plans that God designed, now they're going to become what? Yeah, they'll become, shall rise out of Israel, shall smite the corners of Moab, and Edom shall be a possession. Seir, which is that mountain that He gave to Esau, right? This mountain Seir was given to Esau, and that's why that preservation was going on. And so He says, that's I'm going to change my thought processes in some ways. And ultimately, that's going to happen in very spiritual senses as it relates to Jesus' coming. But it is interesting that God has somewhat changed His mindset about those regions because of their behaviors and choices. And Balaam just keeps sharing that kind of conversation with them. Even a place like Amalek, and people like them, and it's interesting, Amalek was the first of the nations. That's not chronological, by the way. That's in preeminence. They're first above others, and even them are in the hands of God. Even they are in the hands of God. Even the most preeminent, most powerful nations, nobody can overcome what God decides to fulfill and accomplish when He determines to do that. And so you can see all kinds of different things, but let's go back to some of those messianic things. Verse 19, out of Jacob shall come he that shall have dominion. Right? Who's ultimately going to have dominion over everyone? That's Christ, right? The very purpose that God is preserving these people. You can see some of that language here in that verse. Notice verse 23. He took up His parable and said, alas, who shall live when what? When God doeth it, or doeth this. Who is strong enough? Who's powerful enough? I don't care if you were the first of the nations or not, is what Balaam's saying. It doesn't matter whether you feel like you were at the top of the heap and you're the most powerful, nation and group in the region. When God decides it's over for you, it's over. When God decides to do something, you can't stop that. Will we always know what God's planning, purposing, and doing? No, we won't always know that. It won't always be evident. He's not always going to deliver a message that says, this is what I'm doing and this is how I'm doing it. Sometimes God just works and He purposes, and we're, in some senses, oblivious to the realities of what He's doing.
This kind of goes along with what you had mentioned last time when talking about how God's already blessed them. We can't undo it, what they said. God's already decided what this nation's going to do, what their fate is going to be. So no matter how strong you are, it's not going to reverse that effect either.
Yeah. And there's lots of God's purpose happening here, and you're not going to thwart it, right? It's going to stay in line. So finally, then, verse 25, Balaam does what? He goes home. I've seen enough, right? I've seen enough. I've given you enough parables, prophecies, oracles. I've shared enough with you, Balak. You either grasp it or don't, but I'm done, and I'm heading home. I imagine he treated his donkey a little better on the trip home than he did on the trip there. Go ahead, I'm sorry. Thoughts, extra questions about that text before I move into chapter 25?
I thought it was a little interesting that Balaam hadn't really understood. When you go back
Yeah.
into verse 15, 16, no, it's even earlier, sorry, but his eyes are now open. He's
Yeah.
kind of getting what God's really trying to tell him.
Yeah, it took him, for a while, he's just declaring, right, what God is delivering. And clarity is eluding him for maybe a period of time as well. And finally, it all slowly comes to enlightenment, if you will. It's actually parallel to some of the things I'm going to talk about in the sermon today, actually, now that I think about it.
This is kind of where I'm reading right now in Numbers. And in Numbers 31, Balaam is listed as somebody who's killed. I mean, he doesn't have very many more, well, I don't know how long it is, but not very many chapters left.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, his purposes, yeah. Well, sir, we'll get there. You're ahead of me. Go ahead, Patty.
I think what I see in that is just the mercy of God towards
Sure.
Balaam. Because the idea that here he is, ready to go commit grievous sin against God and walk away, and God spares him through a donkey. And that's just a miraculous thing to me, that he's willing to go to that extent to speak through a donkey to say, I don't want you to go this way, come back, go this way. And I marvel in the Old Testament how much God's mercy just keeps showing up and showing up. And I always just thought of him as being such a stern, mean God. That it's amazing to me.
Yeah.
And I know that part, the judgment
Right, that's chapter 25.
But the judgment part is clear, but I still keep seeing the signs of God's love and mercy,
Sure.
even during that time.
Well, and I think what you see is opportunity, but when people just, for lack of a better phrase, kind of fly in the face of God, then ultimately he's like, okay, I've seen enough, and judgment comes, and we'll see that, I think, in chapter.
God is saying it's enough and judgment comes, or that the judgment is already on the sin of the person. I mean, I guess I'm trying to clarify for me the difference between God's judgment in terms of the unrighteous and the righteous. And I just think that sin inherently has a judgment attached to it. So if you, as a Christian, go against God, you're going to sin and maybe reap a whirlwind. But I don't know that God wants that for you.
No. Well, I mean, he does talk about how the wages of sin is death, and the consequences are set in that sense. And that's where penitence and repentance and confession and all those other aspects of things help us bring us back into alignment with God. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Sure. Go ahead, Brian. I'm sorry.
I think all of Numbers 24 with this whole thing with Balaam and Balak, I think it's just another testament, another way of God will use anybody to show the fulfillment of prophecies or to give prophecy, for that matter.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times people didn't understand what they were saying.
Yeah.
It would burn in them. It would just burn in them. They would
Right.
say it, and I also found it interesting, when the Jews were going to go, when the Israelites were going to go into the Promised Land, the God just said, "Take it."
Yeah.
But no, they sent spies, so they were reluctant. Here, he tells Balaam, "Don't go." He goes.
Yeah.
The opposite side of the coin. I find that interesting.
It is. Yeah, I get what you mean. All right, jump to chapter 25. So, and here's one of those cases, right? Chapter 25 is one of those cases. I mean, God has spared them. He's gotten rid. We're in what year of the wandering? 40, right? We're at the end. He's about ready to give this next generation an opportunity to walk into the Promised Land. And then what do? Yeah, you go right into idolatry. So they're cohabitating, right? They haven't possessed, in the sense, any of these regions because they're not theirs to take. The land God's granted unto them is the Promised Land's on the other side of the Jordan. It's on the other side of this conversation. So none of the places they've been residing are theirs, nor will it be ultimately. Well, though some half getting some things, but anyway, but they're living in amongst these idolatrous nations, and yet they still have to maintain. What I tell you a few weeks ago about what I see through all this is God demands purity from His people. And He gave them purification laws. He gave them restrictions. He gave them, if you touch this dead body, then you're going to have to do this. If you're going to, right? There were all those laws and guidances, and they're all about purity. And that purity is necessary because we got to get to whom? We got to get to Jesus. And God's got a perfect plan and purpose in mind as it relates to that. And then all of a sudden, they show up here in chapter 25, and they start to worship what? Yeah, the description here is Baal, which that's just a generic phrase, by the way, to reference any and all gods, right? Idolatrous gods. You'll see that phrase or that word used not necessarily as just a singular entity, but many. And he describes it pretty descriptively here when he says they began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab, and they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods. And the people what? They did eat, and they bowed down to their gods. I mean, this isn't just living within a neighborhood of idolatrous people, because that's where God has planted me in the moment as we're wandering, waiting for our proper time to go take the promised land. This was an active choice to involve themselves in the idolatrous behaviors of the nations they were residing in. And that is infuriating to God. That His people, after all of these things that He's accomplished for them, all of the things He's led them to, all of the promise He's tried to guide them in, this is the result. They're choosing idolatry in the midst of about being able to go and take the promised land that God gives. It's mind-boggling, right? And yet, we can sit here and be hypercritical of the Israelites, but how many times have we stepped into sin and knew better? A lot, right? We've stepped into sin in our own lives and knew better. And sometimes we can look with this critical eye towards and say, that's so awful, and it was, but let's not be so overconfident in self to not realize that we too at times have chosen to go against what we knew God had forbidden, or rejected what God had instructed. We find ourselves, that's what sin is. And we find ourselves in that same boat. Thoughts or questions up to that point? Good.
I noticed that it mentions how, at least in my translation, it says they began to play the harlot, and it's like they start worshiping, the gods that Moab, the place right now at Peor, is worshiping. And you mentioned how we kind of do the same thing after we look and we see all the things that God has done for us. And yet, we instantly go and, if you think about it, we go worship our own idols. Sure. We go with whatever sin that we have. It's our own idols. So really, what's the difference here?
Yeah. And there's not, right? And it's at its base, there's not any difference between what they're doing and what we choose at times. Go ahead, Doris.
I think, too, some of the most dangerous sins are the ones that we can't see.
Yeah.
The ones that where we are sinning either in our heart or sinning because of pride and we don't realize it. Yeah. And then those are the ones that we have a harder time changing because we don't see that that's what our sin is.
Yeah, it's easy for us to criticize a people who went and sat down and ate a meal that had been sacrificed to an idol, and they rose up and bowed down to some structure that men had built, and we can have this outrage but but what we forget so many times is our sinful choices are the way we think and our attitudes about people and other situations and the pride that kicks in. And those aren't necessarily visible in terms of outward actions, but they're just as destructive to the spiritual mindset that all of us should have. And I appreciate that thought. Go ahead, Amy.
And we also have to remember that when they were in Egypt, that was a common, concern. That's what they knew.
Yeah.
That's,
Right, and you're moved beyond a generation, and a lot of those folks had died, and yet those conversations have still potentially been happening. And how they, you think about it. What do people do? They sit around and tell stories, and so if you've had 40 years for Dad to tell his whopper of a story out of Egypt, right? And so imagine a lot of those conversations would have had to have included how they behaved and acted back in the day. Everybody over the age of 35 has already said that probably 2 or 3 times this week. Back in my day, right? Some of you go way back, by the way, but anyway.
Especially when they were saying how great it was in Egypt.
Yeah.
All this to eat and all this.
Yeah. All right, so they've not just kindled the anger of God, but notice, and the Lord said, verse 4, the Lord said unto Moses, take all the heads of the people and hang them up before the Lord against the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. You reach a point where God has been merciful, and he's like, okay, I have to bring justice to this.
And their consequences were immediate.
Yeah. And I think, and you're right, Barb,
Necessary.
yeah, we may lull ourselves into complacency because the eternal consequence that God now has in place happens somewhere down the road. And your mind wants to believe that if we would visibly see some immediate consequences to sinful behaviors, that maybe more people would take notice, but they didn't. Right, exactly. They saw immediate consequences and still didn't always learn from them. So I think men have chosen odd decisions. But you're right. God says I can't even wait till later. A lot of things he does, right? Edom and Moab and some of those judgments he brings against them decades later before they're fulfilled. But this time it's now.
It always makes me think, we think as adults that we're so much different than we were as children, but we're really not. And seeing as how we're God's children, it's like we never get out of the toddler stage. We always, I want to do what I want to do, and I don't want to follow the rules. And, then they had the immediate consequences as, this, you're going to act this way, okay, this is it. Now God's giving us a little more time, and we think, well, we're so much better than that, but really,
We're not.
we
And we
just
abuse
haven't
the
gotten the
time.
consequence yet.
Yeah, we abuse the time.
Yes.
Rather than avail ourselves of that long suffering of God, we actually try to take advantage of it and stay disconnected from him as long as we can, and hope that there'll be that kind of moment at the end where I'll turn the switch, and we actually abuse that privilege.
And on top of that, they literally had God right there in front of them, doing things for them and giving them the food, talking to Moses on the mountain, and they were seeing him do these things. So you would think in their minds they would,
His presence was very direct
yeah.
in those moments, and they could have easily learned from that.
This kind of reminds me of, Balaam's, the way Balaam acted. Balaam was kind of going along with it each and every time, and then finally, after enough time, he's like, I'm done, I'm just going to go home. This is kind of what God's doing here. God's been looking at them, showing them mercy, and finally at this point, he's like, you know what, I'm done.
Yeah.
It's enough.
So you see two different consequences here. Verse 4 talks about their leaders, right? So it takes the leadership that led them down these roads and brings a consequence. And then verse 5, Moses said unto the judges of Israel, slay ye every one his men that were joined unto Baal. So he deals with the leadership and anybody that followed those guys. He's addressing the consequences for both. But here's where this account, I don't like the word story because they're not stories. This is history. And this one's hard, right? Because this is brutal and it's direct and highly consequential. But just notice, and maybe it'll help us understand why. So behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses, and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So set the scene. Leadership. We just did what with them? Yeah, hang their heads right out here so people can see it. Then gather everybody that went with those guys, and they lose their lives. People see the just horrible scene of death all around them, and they're what? They're doing what anybody else would do, you would think, that had any kind of conscience. They're weeping, right? They're weeping at the door of the tabernacle. Multifaceted, right? Because of their silly choices to follow this idolatry that led to this consequence, the loss of so many that chose that path. And then here comes this guy. All of this happened because they intermingled with the idolatrous behaviors of the nations around them. And here comes this guy strolling up to the funeral, right? And he's got this Midianite woman on his arm, just as proud as he can be. That's the imagery I want you to see here. That's why I believe this consequence that comes, that Phinehas delivers, is so severe and so direct and like immediate in the sense of just, we've got to deal with this. We can't, because here's a guy who just saw God's judgment against this intermingling. What have we been saying? What's the thread? Purity, purity, purity. Because these people have got to bring the Son of Man into existence. And so this fell in the midst of all this while everybody else is weeping, while everybody else is mourning what happened and the cause of that happening. Right in the sight of Moses and everybody else, he walks in just flaunting that which they had been forbidden to do. And when Phinehas, verse 7, when he hears the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, Aaron is what, by the way? He's already gone, right? And so remember, he died, and Moses takes the coat of Aaron off of him, and before he died, and he puts it on Eleazar to kind of show that transition. So now Eleazar is kind of sitting in Aaron's seat, and Phinehas, his son, is now kind of filling the void that Eleazar. So you see these guys. They saw it. He saw it, and he rose up from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. So the plague was stayed from the children of Israel, and those that died in the plague were 24,000. So it's interesting numerically, by the way. Do I have time? Yeah. So you think about the severity of all this. There's a reference, and I'm going to conjure it. My brain's kicking in here for a second. It's 1 Corinthians 10:8, I believe. I brought the wrong set of notes. Is that it? Okay. So 1 Corinthians 10, verse 8, Paul tells those in Corinth that at this scene, how many? And I just want you to notice this. He says 23. He says 23,000. Numbers accounts for 24,000. And some say contradiction. No. What you've got is two different sets of people did what happened to them. Two separate ones were right.
They died on another day.
Yeah, you got different times and you've got different situations. But all I want you to just notice is leaders died, everybody else. So you can easily see how you would have a number of people that died. Moses, or rather Paul, refers to one grouping, not them in totality. Numbers simply records for us the totality of that. But it's something I always feel like you got to at least reference and acknowledge, because somebody might say to you sometime, if they're trying to find holes, well, see, here's a discrepancy. You know, Paul said 23 and Numbers says 24, but easily understood how those numbers would be different, and as it relates to that. And it's interesting that he calls this scene a what? When we think about a plague, we usually think of locusts, disease, sickness, right? Water into blood, that kind of thing. But this situation, he calls it a plague. A plague they brought upon themselves because of their choosing of idolatry. And that's, it's just an interesting description that happened here. And so Phinehas, he deals with it. He deals with it. And because he deals with it, God does what? He stays the plague. I'm done. Okay, enough. I think we get it now. We're going to maintain the purity that he desires. And what happens with Phinehas? He's turned away the wrath. He's very zealous, verse 11 says, because I was ready to what again? How many times has this happened, right? Where Moses, Aaron, somebody has to step in between God and the people because God's just ready to swallow them all up. And he says, we're going to elevate Phinehas for his zeal because he was willing to address that situation. I didn't mean to scroll that far past. I wanted to find later in this narrative. I'm running out of time this morning, but I was wanting to note something with you. There it is. I found this interesting. Verse 14. Now the name of the Israelite that was slain, even that was slain with the Midianitish woman, was Zimri, the son of Salu. Almost sounds like, never mind, Rachel, you think about that for a second. Tell me, you can answer my question in my head later, what it sounds like, right? A prince of a chief house among the Simeonites. And the name of the Midianitish woman that was slain was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur. He was head over a people and of a chief house in Midian. I found that interesting. That doesn't happen very often, right? Sometimes you just learn that this guy a guy did this and he suffered consequences. Or somebody did this. But they identify. They put a name to this. Occasionally that happens. In the New Testament, when Paul talked about cancers among them, he said, of the which is Hymenaeus and Philetus, he names them. And sometimes the Bible's very general and just kind of tells you what happened. And sometimes he wants you to put a name to it. Sometimes he wants you to realize these were real people in a real moment in time who had real parents, were part of a real family, who made, and I appreciate that. Because sometimes when you only think abstract, right, or you only think group think, you can convince yourself, well, that's not really relevant to me. But when you hear somebody's name, right, Cosby, strolled around on Zimri's arm and lost her life for it. And when that story is told over the generations, it won't just be there was this guy. It'll be no Zimri. Yeah, yeah, and even her family was well known and connected as it relates to those things. All right, so Wednesday night we're going to switch it up and try to. I may reference, but I'm really moving to chapter 26. Okay, so just move to chapter 26. I might have half a second, but I'll move into 26 on Wednesday night.
Somewhere the sun